What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Green Lantern. Yes, we are, and we are covering the New 52 Green Lantern Volume 1, Sinestro. So, in the War of the Green Lanterns, we basically ended with Sinestro becoming a Green Lantern, which is one of the crazy things because he formed the Sinestro Corps, literally a group designed to kill Green Lanterns, and he is now a Green Lantern. So the whole thing about this is as soon as that happens, the Guardians of the Universe are just like, okay, let's go ahead and go with this. Ganthet's the only one who's against it, right? Just because of the fact that while the other Guardians see it as a quote-unquote chance of redemption, the reality is Ganthet sees it as like, this guy tried to kill us. We literally had to give Green Lanterns the ability to kill people in order to keep these guys from killing all the Green Lanterns. But it's one of those things where Ganthet's kind of being overridden. Now, one of the things that also came out of War of the Green Lanterns is that Ganthet and the idea that he kind of deviated from the mission of the Guardians of the Universe ultimately resulted in him kind of being considered an outlier, right? And so their response was, we will deal with you accordingly. And that's exactly what happens here, right? They essentially kind of band together and basically remove the emotional element from him, so he's strictly a logical being, right? Kind of falling rank and file with the rest of the Guardians here. Now, switching over to Hal Jordan, we saw that Hal Jordan had been discharged from the Green Lantern Corps. He'd basically been booted out and sent back to Earth without a Green Lantern ring. And so what this meant was that going forward, he's just a guy. Nothing special about him whatsoever, right? And this kind of manifests itself in a couple different ways. One, his landlord's demanding 3 months of rent because he's 2 months behind, and pretty much all the superheroes are broke, except for Batman. That's one of the things about the superheroes, right? They don't really do it for money. I would, right? I would be like, all right, guys, I'm here to save the world, but I'm gonna need payment, and I don't take personal checks. I would not be that guy. I would not like force people to pay me to save the world. I would force governments to do it. So here's the thing. Like what he ends up witnessing is basically like an attack, or at least seems like an attack going on in an apartment literally across the street. He jumps from his balcony to this other apartment, comes flying through the window, only to find out that it's basically a great big huge acting job, right? And so ultimately he's arrested and he's bailed out of jail by Carol Ferris. Now, the relationship between Carol Ferris and Hal Jordan was always kind of off and on, right? It was always one of these things where it was a little bit murky, and it was in a lot of ways this kind of situation of, are they going to be able to kind of pull it together, right? Are they going to be able to sort of get together and do their thing? A lot of you guys know the history if you guys have been watching my videos on Green Lantern, but in reality, it's a chance for Hal Jordan to kind of try to bring things back, right? To focus largely on himself and Carol and just kind of see what comes next, right? Because, Hal Jordan's always had a thing for it. But for Sinestro, once he's sent out as a Green Lantern and to really expected to kind of do what Green Lanterns do, the first place he heads to is Korugar. Now, for those of you guys who are kind of catching up here, Korugar is extremely significant for Sinestro for a bunch of different reasons. One, because it's his home world. It's his equivalent of Earth. And two, when he was originally a Green Lantern, the reason why he was initially kicked out and then ultimately became the Yellow Lantern and then essentially created the Sinestro Corps is that he wanted to bring logic and reason to Korugar and basically become a dictator of it, right? Now, a lot of it kind of made sense, right? Korugar up to that point was rife with political discord. Nothing was ever really getting done. Everybody was, seemingly kind of out for themselves in different ways. And so kind of casting all that aside and then basically conquering the world brought order and structure to it. So depending on what stance you're on, it was actually better, right? I mean, yeah, sure, people lost that freedom, but look what they did with it, right? Was their freedom really doing him any favors in the first place? And so ultimately, Sinestro, having had this discovered by the Guardians, was essentially taken and stripped of his role as a Green Lantern because he essentially betrayed the role the Green Lanterns were supposed to uphold, right? Like, yes, you're supposed to protect worlds, but you're also supposed to let them like descend into chaos and madness because of all the political nonsense and so on, right? So it's one of those weird things where it's like, keep the worlds protected, but if they end up destroying themselves, let that happen too. And so ultimately he ended up forming the Sinestro Corps sometime later, and that's where a lot of that stuff happens. The problem is that as soon as he gets back here, he realizes that when he had initially departed the Sinestro Corps, that he didn't necessarily leave as a leader, that he had kind of gone on the whole mission with like Blackest Night and Brightest Day and all that kind of stuff, the War of the Green Lanterns and everything, and essentially charged the Sinestro Corps with protecting Korugar, right? It's the one planet he cares about more than anything else. The problem is the Sinestro Corps basically conquered it and subjugated the people. And so they essentially betrayed the will of Thal Sinestro, because while he is kind of in and of himself, or at least fancied himself a dictator, he didn't really rule in a brutal fashion, right? It was one of these things where it was like, I actually want to see this planet succeed. I want to see good things come out of it. So yeah, I mean, you know, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, right? You can't have it both ways. You can't have like a perfect utopia and then at the same time, no sacrifices or not losing anything in the process. And so it's one of these things where he just kind of takes it upon himself to, one, take out one of the Sinestro Corps members who discovers him, and then two, create a plan to take his planet back. And so following that, what you end up with is a kind of dinner date between Hal Jordan and Carol Ferris. And it's one of these interesting things, right? Because as they're kind of having this conversation, even though the relationship has been on and off again for quite some time, Hal Jordan is just kind of like, okay, so like he starts talking to her and says, look, I never thought I'd be doing this, but I need to ask you something. And she's like, yeah. And then he says like, will you co-sign the new lease on my car? She's like, what? She gets mad because she had talked herself, or she had convinced herself that Hal Jordan was going to ask her to marry him, right? So she kind of tricked herself or made up a story that she in turn believed. It's one of the weird things about human beings, right? We're very illogical, you know, like we convince ourselves something's going to happen, and then when it doesn't happen, we get mad. Like, who told you that was going to happen, right? Like, who convinced you of that? You did. You literally set up your own problem. And so ultimately, Hal's like, I mean, do you think I was going to ask you to marry me? I mean, we just kind of started hanging out again. Like, why would I do that? I mean, just because you convinced yourself doesn't mean you were right. It just means you convinced yourself. And so eventually, like, she just kind of leaves him hanging. He ends up getting back to his apartment. He's got an eviction notice. And then here comes Sinestro, right? And Sinestro's like, if you ever want your ring back, you'll do everything I say. And so what follows here is really interesting, because when it comes to the relationship between Thal Sinestro and Hal Jordan, despite what Sinestro says and a lot of the disdain that he has for Hal Jordan, at the end of the day, he respects him immensely, right? Even if he says he doesn't, he does. And the reason why is because he's here right now. Like, Hal Jordan was literally the first person he went to. He could have gone to Guy Gardner, he could have gone to Jon Stewart, he could have gone to Kyle Rayner, but instead, he went to Hal Jordan. And it's, hey man, I need you to help me with this. Now, initially, Hal Jordan takes like huge offense to the idea that Thal Sinestro is still a Green Lantern, considering his history, leading the Sinestro Corps, killing Green Lanterns, different things like that. And so ultimately, Hal's like, take the ring off, right? And he immediately kind of goes to charge Sinestro, and Sinestro's like, look, this is not going to work, man. And Hal Jordan kind of makes this funny comment, you know, he's like, I'm not afraid of you, and Thal Sinestro's like, as if that mattered, right? That's the thing to know. There are times when you're facing an enemy, it doesn't matter if you're afraid of them or not, they're still gonna crush you, right? Like, fear has nothing to do with it. It's just, you're painfully outmatched. And that's what's going on here, right? Hal Jordan's just a regular guy. You know, Rahu, willpower, doesn't do him any good if he doesn't have a Green Lantern ring, right? At that point, it's just, you know, kind of being a little bit foolish. But ultimately, Thal Sinestro fashions a ring seemingly out of nothing, creates one of his own accord, and then gives it to Hal Jordan. Now, there's caveats here, right? When the ring is given to Hal Jordan and Hal Jordan becomes a Green Lantern again, that he immediately goes to attack Sinestro, only for us to find out with the ring being created by Sinestro, there's huge limitations here. For example, Sinestro can shut it off anytime he wants to. He's programmed the ring so that Hal Jordan can't necessarily attack him with it. Different things along those lines. So in a lot of ways, Hal Jordan is beholden to the will of Thal Sinestro. And that's literally what he says. You work for me, right? Like you are operating under my purview now. And so ultimately he's like, if we're going to do this, there's a few things you need to know. And so what ends up happening is like this massive item, you know, massive thing that comes crashing down, which is actually a member of the Sinestro Corps that was chasing Thal Sinestro, but comes crashing onto Earth, smashes through a bridge, and basically damages the bridge. And then Hal Jordan goes to intervene. And initially, like he saves a woman, and then like he saves a car, and then like Thal Sinestro shuts off his ring, you know, and like literally this girl's pummeling to her death, and he's like, this is your problem, Hal Jordan. You never think big enough. You think too simple, right? And so literally what Sinestro does is he uses his ring and basically saves everybody on the bridge all at one time and forces Hal Jordan to look. Now, this is important because that was always the biggest limitation of Hal Jordan. He was two-dimensional, right? It's what made Kyle Rayner such a great Green Lantern, or so interesting to fans outside of Hal Jordan. Hal Jordan made boxing gloves, or giant wrenches, or a great big huge fist, or like a shovel. He never did anything interesting with his ring. And that's really what Sinestro says. Like, you have the greatest power in the universe, and people here call you a superhero, right? Like, they don't call you that because you've done anything on any gigantic, meaningful scale. They do that because you saved somebody from being attacked by a mugger, or you stopped bank robbers, right? Like, the ring was not meant for you to be used to stop somebody who's robbing somebody else with a giant boxing glove. The ring was meant to be used on a more grandiose scale, to do things to protect the world as a whole, to think bigger than just this small time stuff that you've been doing. And initially Hal Jordan's kind of response or belief here is that Sinestro's trying to talk him into like becoming a dictator, and Sinestro's like, no, it's just, you have to learn to think outside the box, Hal Jordan. You think too small. You don't think big enough. And so ultimately he kind of spills the beans on what's going on, that the Sinestro Corps is taking control of Korugar, and he needs Hal Jordan to essentially help him, save his own world. And that's when Hal's kind of like, okay, look, like that's the thing, but understand, like if we do this, like I need to go talk to Carol Ferris. I need to make things right with her. And Sinestro's like, that's ridiculous, man. What's more important here, right? Like saving what passes for a relationship between you and this girl, or literally saving an entire world. That's the thing, and it's kind of crazy because Sinestro kind of calls him out here, and he's like, saving a world is far more important, right? Like you say you believe in saving the lives of the innocents. You say you believe in saving the lives of people who can't stand up for themselves. Yet when it comes down to it, you're gonna choose making amends to some woman that you've kind of had relationships with over the years, but not really, and it's just a giant gaping wound that you call this kind of romantic interest, instead of saving the lives of innocent people. So what's it going to be? Are you going to be the guy who actually saves lives, or are you going to be this guy who's just trying to look to get with a chick? And ultimately Hal Jordan's like, okay, fine. So he ends up going with Sinestro to basically go and save lives. Now, one of the things about this is that as they get to Korugar, Sinestro's got a bit of a plan here. And one of the things that he did, which is actually kind of wild here, one of the things that he did is that he created a kind of fail-safe in the Sinestro Corps central power battery, which is if you introduce an actual Green Lantern to it, which is to say the little charging lantern that they have, you'll basically destabilize it. It'll basically create a kind of disruption field, right? And that'll lead to the Sinestro Corps rings basically failing. And it's one of the funny things because it's the last thing Green Lanterns would have thought of. Hey guys, the Sinestro Corps is running amok. They're literally killing Green Lanterns everywhere we find them. I have a hunch. Maybe we should put one of our lanterns inside the yellow central power battery and it'll shut it down, right? Like no Green Lantern is thinking of that, right? No Green Lantern, that would never come to mind. So it's one of the best things to do. And even by Hal Jordan's response, it takes him by surprise. Now, even with that happening, they're kind of watching all this go down, right? Because Thal Sinestro is going to kind of run interference or sort of be the main distraction. And then in turn, Hal Jordan is expected to fly into the central power battery, introduce the Green Lantern, and essentially shut down all the Sinestro Corps rings. And when that's happening, they actually see this young girl who's being tormented by one of the members of the Sinestro Corps, and Thal Sinestro's like, no, we can't act, right? We cannot act right now. If we do, they'll slaughter them all. So sure, you'll save a young girl at the expense of dozens of other people, right? Like this is one of those times, Hal Jordan, when the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And that's really one of the biggest failings of Hal Jordan and really superheroes as a whole, right? Like there are times when you just have to sacrifice somebody for the greater whole. Superheroes, the way they're written, kind of flies in the face of that and says, no, you actually can save everybody. But that's what makes villains a lot more interesting is but no, you can't though. I mean, like, it'd be nice if you could, but you can't. Like, and in the times that you cannot, what are you going to do? Are you just going to go crashing in there foolhardy and just sort of like save one person and sacrifice dozens? Or are you going to sacrifice one and save dozens? And that's what this is. Sacrifice one to save dozens of people. And so it's one of those funny things because suddenly Sinestro just flies into the middle of the whole thing. Literally ignores everything he just told Hal Jordan. And the reason why is because there's a girl named Arsona who's there that's basically kind of interfering, right? Attacking one of the members of the Sinestro Corps. And Sinestro recognizes her and immediately goes intervening there, right? So Hal Jordan's like, okay, I guess this is when we make our move. So then he goes to fly into the central power battery. But when he does, it doesn't work, right? Like Green Lantern detected, disintegration process initiated, and Hal Jordan is just kind of crushed, right? I mean, he's not really killed, right? But like as far as he goes, he's like, it doesn't work, right? It doesn't work the way that it's supposed to. And so ultimately, Hal Jordan is basically captured by the members of the Sinestro Corps, and so is Sinestro himself. And so it's kind of crazy because ultimately Hal Jordan is taken to a location where basically his power will just kind of drain off, mostly because he'll use it to try to get out, but there's no real way for him to escape. And as we know, Green Lantern rings only have a finite charge. They have to recharge them on a regular, but being separated from Sinestro Sinestro's lantern, there's no real way for Hal Jordan to do that. Not only that, the ring he has is not as powerful as a ring normally is, and so the energy drains off even faster than that. And so one of the last things he does is kind of conjure an image of Carol Ferris, kind of apologize to it as a way to sort of soothe his guilty conscience, and then his ring energy fades away. As far as Sinestro goes, he's being tortured by his own core. Now, there are some who are kind of looking at this from the perspective of maybe he's being manipulated by the Guardians, maybe Hal Jordan's controlling him, but no way Thal Sinestro would turn against his own core. Others are like, it was only a matter of time, right? Like, we could never really have allegiance to Thal Sinestro because look at his history, he has no allegiance to anybody but himself. But regardless, Thal Sinestro's thrown in a kind of prison room with everybody else who is basically captured by the Sinestro core, including this girl. And so as they have this kind of conversation, we end up realizing that for Arsona, what ended up happening is that when Thal Sinestro initially started rising to power, she was instrumental in making that happen because she believed that he was actually going to make Korugar a much better place. She didn't believe that he was going to do the things like wiping out anybody who disagreed with him or whatever. Now again, this is just the nature of just kind of cleansing dissent, right? You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. And if the people who are dissenting against you are the ones who want to keep things in a state of chaos, then they gotta go, right? That's just the way it is. The Americans did it to the British. That's the way this kind of thing goes, right? Like whenever you're inciting rebellion and you're overthrowing an existing government and replacing it with one that's better, there are always going to be people out there who are like, no, we want things to stay the same. The people who are largely against what you're doing will largely be the ones who are in favor of keeping things the same, right? We want chaos. We want political discord. We don't want things to get better under your rule. We want things to stay bad. And that's why Sinestro was just like, they all gotta go, like literally killing them off and getting rid of them. But Arsona took this as a personal affront because she believed she had been used in order to make that happen. And the reality is that she was, right? She really was used in a lot of ways, but in the ends justified the means. At least it seemed like it did until basically Sinestro was just kind of cast out, right? And everything popped off and the Sinestro Corps conquered the entirety of the world. And so what goes on is that while this kind of conversation's happening between Arsona and Sinestro, Hal Jordan's kind of listening in. And Hal Jordan kind of talks to her while Sinestro's trying to at least explain himself to everybody. Hal Jordan chimes in and says, look, you made my ring, right? And Sinestro's like, yeah. And so he's like, make more, right? I mean, they're not going to be nearly as powerful. They're not going to last all that long. But in the end, make more rings. Because even if these rings only last 5 to 10 minutes, like Sinestro says they will, it'll be 5 to 10 minutes longer they can survive. And you can do a lot of damage in 5 to 10 minutes. When you're a Green Lantern, you can take out a lot of people in 5 to 10 minutes. And so ultimately he fashions like 100 rings, and then they just kind of go out and they end up, kind of bonding to all these different people here. And then they initially kind of go to take the revenge on Sinestro, but the whole point of Sinestro, and really what Hal Jordan says is, look guys, I get you got your beef with Sinestro, so do I, but understand, it's the only way for us to get out of here. So either you can deplete this ring's charge by killing Sinestro and then die yourself at the hands of the Sinestro Corps, or you can ally yourself with a guy that you don't necessarily like, and we can all get out of here. We can live, and we can get rid of the Sinestro Corps, and you can go back to doing whatever it is that you want to do. And so ultimately, they side with Sinestro. At the same time, he summons his Green Lantern, of course, comes flying directly to him, and then in turn, he tells everybody there, no fear, right? Do not experience fear in any form or fashion. Conquer it. If you do, you'll empower the Sinestro Corps, and there's no possible way that you'll survive all this, right? And so Hal Jordan pops back up, Sinestro pops back up, all these people with rings start popping back up. The problem is the rings start to vanish, right? The rings start to disappear. And that when that happens, Thal Sinestro and Hal Jordan immediately beeline for the central power battery, because the reality is that all these folks here, Arsona and all them, I wouldn't go as far as to say that they're cannon fodder, but they're as good as, right? I mean, the rings weren't going to last all that long, but the hope is that Sinestro and Hal Jordan could get to the central power battery and basically shut it down before everything else goes on. And they do, right? As soon as they get to the central power battery, and literally Sinestro uses his lantern because he had to be the one to be in there instead of Hal Jordan, it basically shuts down everybody who has a Sinestro Corps ring and kind of puts them into a sort of coma. And they won't wake back up until Sinestro allows them to, right? Until he turns the central power battery back on. And so that's one of those things, because what this does is it temporarily removes the Sinestro Corps from the Green Lantern mythos. Kind of Jeff Johns and company, really Doug Mink, just kind of clearing all these different things out, right? And kind of making way for what's going on. The other part of this is that Sinestro basically grabs the central power battery of the Sinestro Corps, gathers up everybody who was a member of the Corps, and then just kind of takes off and, with the intention of just kind of locking them up or taking them to other places. And then of course, Hal Jordan is teleported back to Earth. And that's kind of the funny thing is he's like, okay, I've got my ring, but I don't have a lantern. I have no way of charging this thing. So at this point, it's just a little fashion piece, right? Like, hey, y'all, ballin' with a green ring, and like that's it, right? So there is a kind of bit of a mends that goes on between him and Carol Ferris. Like, hey, like we're gonna, we'll try to make it work, and we'll knock boots for a little while. We'll kind of see where things go. But the big takeaway from this is that Sinestro does return to Oa. He hands over the Sinestro core, and that's what the Guardians of the Universe were looking for. They kind of figured as soon as they made Sinestro a Green Lantern, the first thing he would do is he would beeline to Korugar back home. And then as soon as he got there, the Guardians knew he would realize the Sinestro core had conquered his world, and that in doing that, he would basically round up the Sinestro core really out of pride or anger more than anything else, and then hand them over to the Guardians and clear the path. And so much like Hal Jordan being out of the picture, or at least suspected to be out of the picture, the Sinestro core is as well, which really makes things easy for the Guardians' plans, because what they intend to do is actually wake up the First Lantern, and the First Lantern will lead the Third Army, which will replace the Green Lantern Corps. And if any of you guys know anything about the First Lantern, you know that guy is a monster. But with that being said, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.